Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to have a session with Professor Subhadra Channa ma'am, and today's topic is indigenous. Hello.
Yes, what happened? Hmm. What happened, Rita?
Yeah, ma'am, there was some error. Good afternoon, ma'am. And
Mhm.
today we are going to have a session on indigenous knowledge system, resource conservation, and sustainability. We
Hmm.
welcome you, ma'am. And ma'am, you can start the session, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Rita. So today, as announced, we shall be talking about indigenous knowledge and how that is related to resource conservation and sustainability, because we have to find the link between them. But as we had discussed earlier, also, whenever we have a term like indigenous knowledge or anything else for that matter, these are all concepts. And when we talk about indigenous knowledge, it is important for us to first understand what do we mean by knowledge and how has knowledge been defined. Next slide, Rita. How has knowledge been defined? And knowledge is something like, if we just take a very commonplace understanding of knowledge, knowledge is something that is useful, which we can use. So whenever we are doing something, we expect that we're going to have a knowledge about it. But that's a very commonplace. But generally speaking, knowledge in the sense that it is understood as something of value, something the acquisition of which gives us a higher status, like we say that we are knowledgeable. So, this knowledge somehow over the years, and this is, of course, again a very well understood sociological principle, that what gets accepted as knowledge, that when we say that you are knowledgeable, or when a person gains status as being knowledgeable, or in some other context, like you can get a job, or you can get a position, or you can get recognition, the kind of knowledge that gives us all this in the present day context in our societies and in most societies of the world has become associated with a particular body of knowledge, a knowledge that has a historical context, and a historical context that relates it to a power center. That power center is what we call as the Euro American or the First World today. Whatever comes or is, but this is not just begun now, but it began maybe around 3 4 centuries back, when what we call as Western science developed. Now, I am calling it Western science because I'm calling it from a sociological perspective. But generally, this is known as science. So, what is science or understood as science, and which follows a particular methodology, which we call a scientific methodology, is sourced from this particular historical period in a particular global context. That is, in Europe, during the 16th and 17th century, a body of knowledge developed, which today is accepted all over the world as science. It has its own methodology, as many of you who are science students know. The scientific methodology that is based on observation, experimentation, validation. Validity is a very important dimension of scientific knowledge, demonstrability, that whatever is validated, what you have as a proposition, it should be demonstrable and provable. And all this proof, this demonstration, and even the collection of data, all this is within the material dimension, in the sense that visible and also transmittable. So we know that we go to the school, we go to college, we go to higher institutions of learning, we read books, we go to the libraries and laboratories, and we gain this knowledge and we acquire it. And we call it knowledge, scientific knowledge. But at the same time, you see, this Western system of knowledge was based upon a particular philosophical principle. And this philosophical principle is what we call as the Cartesian duality. That is, there is a difference between mind and matter. So all science falls in the domain of matter, or something that is sensory, perceptible, or knowable. Even if it is something abstract like mathematics, it can still be taught. You can teach people mathematics, although mathematics is the least material of all sciences, because it is abstract, it is in the mind. But otherwise, science does follow both the principles of induction and deduction. By induction, we mean the empirical process of data collection. Whether we are collecting data in the laboratories, we are collecting data in the field, or in whatever way from the books we collect data or from our observations, this data is then subject to a process of analysis, and the analysis goes on in the mind. It is not a material process, it is what we call as the deductive process. The deductive process is the logical or the mental process. So science also has both processes, that is the mental and the material dimension, the inductive and the deductive. But yet, it is more associated with what we call as factuality. Science is based on, as we say, facts. And facts are both demonstrable and also can be communicated. So this is the system that we call as knowledge. Of course, there are other forms of knowledge. There is philosophical knowledge, there is social scientific knowledge, but those again follow more or less the same principles. That is, even if we study sociology or anthropology or psychology, we can acquire this knowledge from the books. We can get it from our classrooms. We have specific tools and technology of transmission of this knowledge, all of which is very material, and also it is in a way what we call as inscripted knowledge. Inscripted knowledge means that it can be written down, and nowadays of course we have digital technology, so it can be digitalized. In some way it can be stored and transmitted. So having accepted this as knowledge, other forms of acquiring knowledge, other forms of transmitting knowledge have all become what we call as alternative or hyphenated forms. You understand the concept of hyphenated. For example, if I say American, what do you have in mind? What immediately comes to your mind? A white person, Anglo-Saxon, of course, Protestant we say, but say a Christian or something like that. So, but these are not the only forms of America. There are many other Americans. For example, we hyphenate and say African American, which means the black population. We hyphenate and we say native population, Native Americans. So it means indigenous people. And like that, you can be an Asian American, you can be a Korean American, you can be a Chinese American, but just American by itself, when we say, what we mean is the not numerically most proponent, not somebody who is belonged to that place, because the people who really belong to America were the Native Americans, but somebody who is politically dominant, in the sense that is the dominant image of an American. In the same way, uh, when we say knowledge and we don't hyphenate it, we are referring to this dominant mode of knowledge, which is Western scientific knowledge applied to any field on the methodology. So when we say indigenous knowledge is a hyphenated form of knowledge. That is, it is not accepted as knowledge per se, but accepted as a particular form of knowledge. Now, this hyphenation, I'll give you the example of America. This hyphenation means that this form of knowledge is actually seen as peripheral and marginal. You understand what I mean? So when I say I have knowledge, I would mean that I have knowledge gained from the books, from the libraries, from the typical method of transmission of knowledge, which we accept as knowledge. So other forms, indigenous knowledge. Indigenous knowledge is not this form of knowledge. What kind of knowledge is indigenous knowledge? It is outside of what we accept as the central or the most dominant form of knowledge. It is not the knowledge that has been produced through the scientific methodology, which comprises of objectivity, ethical neutrality, experimentation, and all the different characters of this scientific methodology. So what kind of knowledge is this? This is the knowledge that belongs to the people we call indigenous. And who are these indigenous people? The indigenous people are the marginalized people. The people who are not at the center of power. The people who are not the rulers in any country practically. And the people who we look upon as the alternates. So when we say Americans, we mean Americans. When we say indigenous Americans, we mean these marginalized people. Now, this whole concept of indigenous has a historical relevance, and this is related to the whole history of colonization. The word indigenous means, quite literally, people who are original to a particular place. During the process of colonization, what had happened, a large number of continents, entire continents, including America, then New Zealand, Canada, Australia, all these continents were taken over by other populations, mainly the white European populations. And they were colonized in the way that post-colonization, that is after colonization, these outside communities became the main communities of these places. So today when we talk, say, Australian, a white person comes to our mind. When we say American, a white person comes to our mind. Same for New Zealand, same for Canada. But prior to colonization, there were other people there. This was the home of different people, different ethnic groups. And these groups have now become completely marginalized. Many have died out. A few that are left now lead a completely marginalized existence. So, this term indigenous has a lot of political interpretation behind it. Firstly, it refers to those people who were indigenous to a particular place but who were dominated, colonized, and marginalized. Marginalized in such a way that everything that they have, their cultures, their way of life, including their systems of knowledge, were seen as either not knowledge, like nobody recognized. This term indigenous knowledge has also come in use very recently, in the past maybe a couple of decades or maximum 3 decades. Before that, for example, when I was a student, I never heard of indigenous knowledge. So this is something which has just come up. But before that, prior to that, whatever knowledge was possessed by these people was not recognized as knowledge. Knowledge was only recognized as that produced in the West. But over the years, there has been a resurgence of the knowledge of those people who do not belong to these dominant colonizing nations. And the reason for this is purely political. Because post-colonization, other countries which were earlier colonized are coming into power. India, for example. Now, today, if you know, even in the government hospitals, you have what we today call as Ayush, alternative forms of medicine. But these were not recognized, as I told you, even 20 years back. 20 years back, if you went to a hospital, the only form of medicine by which you could be treated was the Western medical system. That was the only one that was recognized. But it is over a period of years, with gaining of power, gaining of identity. Today, India is also a powerful country. It has an identity. It has, you can say, commanding respect. So, commanding respect. Earlier, none of these countries that were colonized, the original inhabitants did not command any respect. And today, there is indigenous people. Now, these people were the most marginalized. In India, the indigenous people are called the tribals. And as you know, the tribals are not part of our mainstream. We just look at them, in the 26th January parade, and we think that they perform exotic dances and they have some, different lifestyle. And the same is true for the Native Americans of the New Zealand Maoris, the Australian Aborigines, the Canadian First Nation people. All these people were totally marginalized in this process of colonization, both external colonization and internal colonization. Internal colonization, that within the country also, within the same indigenous populations of a country, some are dominant and some are marginalized. And in China, in India, where not external colonization, but there is internal marginalization. So this particular form of knowledge, which we refer to now as indigenous knowledge, it belongs to this most marginalized sections globally, wherever they are found, in whatever form. So what kind of knowledge is this? So politically, the most marginalized. In terms of its application and its value and the status given to you, again, inferior. Nobody will give you a degree. If you study indigenous knowledge, yes, but if you are just the possessor of indigenous knowledge, you are not entitled to get a degree in any university. You are not entitled to get a job. This is still knowledge that is unrecognized within the hierarchy of knowledge. So what kind of knowledge is this? This is the knowledge, as I said, belongs to the indigenous people. Now, who are these indigenous people? The indigenous people are those that are outside of the major capitalist systems of economy. They are mostly associated with what we call as subsistence modes of economy: hunter, food gatherers, forest dwellers, pastoral economies, shifting cultivators, those who live in remote areas, or even if they live in the central, for example, central Indian, they are not within this capitalist economic system of production and exchange. Their systems of knowledge are practical, gained through their direct contact with nature. It is what we call as an experiential form of knowledge, a knowledge that you gain only from experience. Of course, this is not just these people who get experience knowledge. Your grandmothers had a lot of experiential knowledge. People who live in rural areas, even in urban areas, as I said, people gain a lot of knowledge through experience over a lifetime. Like, for example, when elderly women, they go and do cooking. And if you ask them something, they say, oh, we just cook like that. They are not able to translate it into the way it is translated, say, on Facebook or in one of these, you have these digital platforms teaching cooking, take 2 spoons of this and 4 teaspoons of that, and 5 grams. An elderly woman will not be able to, she will be an excellent cook, but she will not be able to translate it into 5 grams and 2 spoons, and they just do it experientially, just through their knowledge gained. So this form of knowledge is first and foremost very difficult to communicate. And it comes with a direct involvement with your environment. People who live in the forests gain enormous knowledge about the forest. People who are rearing animals have enormous knowledge about these animals. Mountain dwellers have lot of knowledge about the mountain terrain, the landscape. The seafarers, the sea dwellers, the people who live on the coast have enormous knowledge about, but all that knowledge has been gained not from books, not from learning, not to some extent communication, but this communication is also of a different type. It is the communication of an apprentice with the teacher. So if you want to learn fishing, and if you want to do it through a book, it will be very difficult. What will be much easier and the accepted mode? Go with somebody who knows fishing and just be along, tag along, learn. It takes time. Sometimes it may take years to learn something, but that is the only way you will learn it, by practical engagement. So indigenous knowledge is something which we gain through practical engagement. And often, especially in those communities which have a long association with their environment, it leads to modifications of the senses. They learn to see, they learn to listen, hear, they can taste, they can feel through touch. A lot of things which none of us who are bred in the cities can do. For example, I'll give you an example. I was doing field work in a very remote area in West Bengal, and there were these tribal people. And when they were used to go, then they used to go often into the forest to collect minor forest produce, this and that. But they would always go barefoot. So I asked them, why don't you wear shoes when you go to the forest? They said, no. If we wear shoes, we will not be able to feel the floor of the forest. We will not know which animal is coming, who is nearby. For example, with their feet, by touching the forest floor, they can come to know if there is a snake nearby, or if an elephant is coming, or if there is some danger, if there is. So they, through their senses, they can feel, they can smell, they can hear the noises which will escape us. So, for a forest dweller, a forest is a place that is to be felt through their senses. And this is how they survive, and this is how they navigate their way across the around the forest. Now, again, from my own experience, I met this group of camel breeders, the Raikas in Rajasthan. Now, these camel breeders can read the footprints of the camels. If they see a footprint, they can identify the camel to which that footprint belongs. This is called footprint reading. This is also found amongst many indigenous people who can read the footprints of animals. Read it like when they look at the footprint, it is like looking at a photograph. They can identify the animal, the sex, the age, whether it is pregnant, it is a male or a female or an old animal. And in fact, the border security force often uses these Raikas, at least at that time they used to use, to identify camels that were being used for, cross-border smuggling. So if there is a smuggling operation going on, the BSF cannot identify which camel was used, because once they identify which camel was used, they would identify who did it. So they would call the Raikas and ask them which camel it is, and they can identify. Once they see the footprint, they see the camel, they will know. They will say, this is the footprint of this camel. So this is the kind of knowledge which is very useful, very important, but unfortunately, it is not the kind of knowledge that you can get from books. It is experiential knowledge. Like, even before the compass was invented, all over the South Seas, there were these native communities who were excellent seafarers. They were excellent navigators. How did they navigate the sea without the compass? Now, in the modern day, or after the invention of the compass, people can't do it because they need to know the direction. But these people could tell the direction by reading the sky. They were expert readers of the sky. So this is what indigenous knowledge comprises of. The most important dimension of indigenous knowledge, and which is important to us for this particular discussion, which centers on sustainability, is that it can only come through a direct engagement with your environment, with your habitat, with the knowledge, not only a knowledge of your habitat, but a sense of belonging there. Because this association is not the kind of association that outsiders have. This is the kind of association which gives rise to a kind of kinship with your environment. It's like the forest dwellers don't say that the forest belongs to us. They always say we belong to the forest. To them, the forest is also sacred. It has a lot of power. It is almost like, that is imbued with powers and spirits. And so this relationship in itself is a very different kind of a relationship than the kind of relationship that Western science has told us. Western science told us that nature is external to human society. The terms that they used for nature was wild, natural, instinctual, and also with the associated paradigm that nature, not being human, being outside of human society, was also exploitable. That there was no ethical concerns about exploiting nature, even about destroying nature. Like, as you know, the initial period of colonization all across the globe was one of mass destruction of nature. Complete deforestation, complete destruction of ecosystems, entire North American plain, for example. Today you have cities, New York, and this and that, and the whole paraphernalia. But earlier it was a prairie, long grass meadows with the buffaloes. So it was a completely different, that is totally gone, which means it's a complete transformation of nature. At that time, people were very proud of it. They were proud that with our science, with our technology, we can conquer nature. The word was exactly used as the conquest of nature. You conquer nature, you tame nature, you establish your cities uh, in these natural, environments, and you are very proud of it. You praise yourself, you pat yourself on the back and said, we have achieved something. And therefore, that way of knowing, that Western scientific way of knowing, that form of knowledge was used for domination, for exploitation, and to a large part also of destruction. Whereas the indigenous form of knowing, which is an engagement with nature, an engagement with the nature in a way that nature is your kith and kin. Like the Nayakans, as Nuri Bird David, Israeli anthropologist who has studied the Nayakans in South India, she has said that they look upon the forest as their parents. They say this forest is our father and forest is our mother. So the forest gives us everything that we need. But what do we have to do in return? Exactly what we do to our parents. We have to respect the forest. We have to take care of the forest. We have to be humble before the forest. We can never say that I will conquer the forest or I will destroy the forest. You don't say that to your parents. You don't say that to your mother and father, I will destroy you, I will conquer you. So these people don't either. Even when they hunt, like the hunting food gathering people, when they hunt an animal, they perform the last rites of that animal. They perform the last rites of that animal exactly as you perform that of your kith and kin. They ask forgiveness. They say, we have killed you because we were hungry, we wanted food. But we will help your spirit in whatever way, to get rebirth or to go to heaven or whatever. So they perform the last rites. They treat even the hunted animal with the respect that they would give to their own kith and kin. So this form of knowledge, and this is the important part, is the form of knowledge which gives rise to a relationship with the environment, which is very different in basic nature from the kind of knowledge that has led people, including scientists, to exploit and dominate nature for several centuries. But then what happened? As I said, for a long time, everybody was very proud of this domination, that we can use technology, we have guns, so we can shoot animals, we have what you call chainsaws and machines with which we can cut forests, we can destroy forests, we can make cities there, we can clear the undergrowth, we can do everything. And only by the end, I think not before the 70s or 80s, 1970s or 1980s, we have the term or the notion of sustainability. Earlier, it was only conquest of nature, use of technology, dominate nature, build more. Development was only one linear line. More and more conquest of nature, more and more domination of nature, more and more human built environments. But it is only by the 70s and 80s, especially after the discovery of the hole in the ozone layer, that everybody across the world became aware that what is actually happening is not domination of nature alone, but what is happening is a form of destruction that is coming back to the humans. That humans, in this process of destroying nature, what they consider nature, are destroying themselves. But that they were doing because they had separated humans from nature. These people, the indigenous people, whom Ramachandra Goa and Madhav Gadgil have called the ecosystem people. Who are these ecosystem people? The ecosystem people are those that have not separated the humans and the non-humans, have not separated culture from nature. They have lived with the use of their culture that is integrated within nature, which does not make any separation between, say, an animal and a human, between a tree and a god. The higher altitude pastoral people I have worked with, they consider each tree to be a god. Each tree is a devata, and each tree must be respected. So, this entire scientific knowledge came under a lot of criticism after the effects of the destruction of indiscriminate destruction of nature became more and more visible, and it is very, very visible now. Today, what are we talking of? We are only talking of climate change, global warming. We are talking of concepts such as sustainability and things like diversity, ecosystems, which were never there before. Even when people studied ecology, they only studied two things. One, how to dominate, and then later how to manage. But this management was all what we call as anthropocentric or focused on human beings. So what do you do? So the early forest policies, and even today, most of the environmental policies are not directed towards treating nature as sacred, or treating nature as your parents, or treating nature as your kith and kin, but as something which needs to be managed for human use. And this has also been called as the paternalistic approach to nature. And both the destructive and the paternalistic approach are derivatives of Western science, of that particular form of knowledge only. This sustainability, a term that became very popular with Brunfeld's report, Brunfeld's report on sustainability, what does it say? It says that we have misused our technological power and scientific knowledge to the extent that we are destroying the world for our future generations. Now, of course, at that time it was still future generations, but today it is not even the future generation, it is the now, the present. Because as we see, when you read the newspapers, when you see the news, you see fires raging in California, you see volcanoes erupting, you hear about all kinds of untimely floods, rains, the snow melting, and everything. There is chaos all over the world, and technology is not able to cope with it. Technology has not been able to cope with the pandemic in which we are living today. So all this is related to a failure, more or less, not complete, but at least to a large extent, not probably the system of knowledge, but probably the way it has been applied, the philosophy of this anthropocentric application of technology. Considering the humans to be the center of the universe and everything else revolving around it, that is not the way it happens. And not only that, it is not even all about the entire humanity. Today, again, with the COVID-19 pandemic, people are realizing another factor and something which has been coming up again and again. For the past at least 1 decade, I have been seeing in every conference, economic summit, or global summits on development. One another factor is the stratification of humans. So, in these indigenous communities, they are also marked by what we call as relative egalitarianism, in the sense that in a tribal community, in an indigenous community, resources are not stratified to the extent that some people will starve and some people will have more than what they need. No. Within a camp, within a community, within a village, there is always this relatively equitable. It's not that there is complete equitable egalitarianism, but there is never somebody who is allowed to go below the level of subsistence. There are no beggars in indigenous communities. They become beggars only when they come outside, when they are forced into the cities, and when their actual resource base and their way of life is destroyed. But within the original way of life, everybody, as long as there is something, everybody will have a portion of it. But in this modern world, this modern capitalist world, we developed this notion not only of exploitation of nature, but exploitation of humans by humans, to the extent that a large amount of resources of the world are now concentrated in the hands of few practically individuals. What is the repercussion of this? You see, when the first world countries were exploiting the third world countries during colonization, they thought that, okay, we will extract them, we will destroy their forests, we'll take away all their gold, mines, everything. We'll let the people starve, let the people die off, we don't care. We will make ourselves wealthy. They did that. But by the time it came to the middle of the last century, as I said, the 20th century, people started realizing it didn't work. Because if you destroy somebody else's resources, you're still destroying the resources of the earth. And the earth belongs equally to everyone, and we belong to this earth. So, if you are putting so much carbon out in the air, if you are polluting the environment, the atmosphere encompasses the entire globe. It does not, it is not confined. There is no wall between America and the rest of the world. So if they are putting out so much pollutants, ultimately it comes back to them. Maybe in a lesser extent, maybe later, but sometimes it does. So when there was a hole in the ozone layer, which was right above, people realized that no, this doesn't work. There is one global environment. The environment is not compartmentalized according to your geopolitical boundaries. You may have a line of control. That only is the political boundary. That does not separate out your environment. What happened with COVID-19? This is exactly what happened. It originated in one place, it spread all across the globe because the virus does not recognize that it needs a passport and a visa to cross boundaries. It doesn't, it just goes. So this is how this whole notion of sustainability has become associated with the notion of cooperation and holism, that the ecosystem is one. There is a global environment, and if we need to sustain it, we will have to somehow, like again with the pandemic. Now, what is happening is, you may vaccinate and you may treat, you may have all the facilities for your own country. But if that is happening, if the pandemic is spreading in a country next to you or anywhere in the globe where people are very poor, where they have no vaccines, it will come back. No, it you cannot confine it and say, okay, COVID-19, you stay with the poor. No, it will jump up and it will come to the rich as well. So the problem with sustainability is that if we follow the philosophy and the paradigms of Western science and Western capitalism, as well as the geopolitical nature of the contemporary world, that we can say that, okay, this is my country and this is your country. I will create waste in my country and I'll dump it on your shores, which was happening during all this spread of capitalism. That, for example, you have an hazardous industry, and that hazardous industry originates in Great Britain or in America, and it is located in India or Bangladesh. So those people who are located there think that, oh, we have passed all the hazards, but that is not happened. It happened into a limit, but beyond that limit, when it became a question of global warming. Now, today we say global warming. We don't say America warming or India warming or China warming, do we? Because the climate affects everybody. The oceans encompass the whole world. So the ocean currents, the air, the water, it circulates all over. So this compartmentalization is impossible. When we go back to indigenous systems of knowledge, there we find that already these principles were existing. The principles or the philosophies where there was no separation between human and non-human, where there was no separation between nature and culture, where there was this holistic perspective that, like in a community, if there is something, everyone must have it. You cannot let somebody starve and have 2 portions of food yourself. No, because then it is not conducive with that principle of community. Now, most indigenous people did not have individual ownership. They had this notion of not even community ownership. As I said, forest dwellers do not say we own the forest. They say we belong to the forest. Now, if more people across the globe had the philosophy that they don't own this earth, they belong to this earth, things would have been very different. Then you would not be talking about only your bank balance and your GDP and how many billions you are earning, or whether you are the biggest billionaire on this earth, with the result, no matter if in that process of becoming a billionaire, you have destroyed half the earth and half its people. Then it would be like, it is my family. This earth is a family. This earth and the humans as well as the non-humans are all bounded by relationships of kinship. So you cannot exploit. So like when a hunter food gatherer, they hunt an animal, they feel sad like they had killed a king. They perform rituals, they ask forgiveness, and they will only kill an animal only if they are hungry. Hunters never, these people, the subsistence economies, the indigenous people don't kill for fun. Hunting is not a game for them like it has been. And that is, you see, hunting food gathering is the mode of subsistence by which humans have lived 99% of their lives as Homo sapiens, more than 99%. In that little bit when they become quote unquote civilized, and even in that even smaller fraction when they develop science and technology like the gun, in that span of just a couple of 100 years, so many animals became extinct because they were hunted for no reason at all. Now, this is illogical. This is not what knowledge should be about. Knowledge should be about being reasonable, logical. And there is no logic or reason in being destructive for the sake of being destructive. It doesn't really, it's not a useful thing. So, indigenous knowledge systems were always directed towards being actually useful. Whether or not they created any surplus, it didn't matter, because the surplus again was redundant. Why should you have surplus? In these communities, if people don't need something, they don't do it. Like in a shifting cultivation, a lot of things are left on the tree or underground. They only harvest just as much as is required, because unnecessary accumulation is a philosophy. It is not something that is useful for your survival. So, the sustainable development is something which needs not a technological transformation. Sustainable development needs a change in your way of thinking. So when we say indigenous knowledge, or if you go back to the indigenous knowledge, it is not that we become hunters and food gatherers. No, that is not required. What is required is we imbibe some of their philosophies and values, and we try and apply them to the modern context so that we are able to change our exploitative lifestyles. Thank you.